Influence of the Renaissance, Part 1. The Renaissance was a cultural movement occurring in Europe from the 14th to the 17th century. This cultural movement was believed by many historians as the movement that led Europe into the modern times. The authors of our textbook also agreed to such an argument. In page 33 of the textbook, the authors brought up 2 points. They are beginning of modern times and basis of modern civilization. The author wrote, during the Renaissance, a new way of thinking developed. Feudalism and the Christian Church no longer had great influence. People could now think freely, and they began to question unreasonable ideas and beliefs. This spirit of the Renaissance led Europe into the modern times. The author also wrote, soon after its birth in Italy, the Renaissance spread to other parts of Europe. Under the influence of humanism, achievements were made in many areas, such as literature, painting, sculpture, and science. The development of arts and science during the Renaissance formed the basis of modern Western civilization. So, these are the 2 points brought up by the author. Let's take a closer look to these 2 points. The first point, beginning of modern times. What is meant by the modern times? In Form 1, we have studied different historical periods. Say, for example, the period of prehistory or prehistoric times, or the period of history or historic times. The prehistoric time was distinguished from the historic times in that writing was invented during the historic times. And these 2 historical periods can be further divided into some shorter periods. Say, for example, the period of history or historic times can be divided into smaller periods like the ancient times, Middle Ages, modern times, and the contemporary periods. When the author said that the Renaissance led Europe into the modern times, what does this mean? You can refer to the timeline on the left-hand side of this piece of slide. The timeline indicated that Renaissance was a cultural movement emerging at the end of the Middle Ages. This timeline also indicated that the Renaissance ushered in the period of the modern times. Now, when we stress that the Renaissance brought about the beginning of the modern times, we are actually saying that the modern era was different from the Middle Ages. So, we have to examine in what ways was the Middle Ages different from the modern times. In order to understand the difference between the Middle Ages and the modern times, let's take a look at this table, which shows the daily schedule of a medieval lord. A medieval lord is a noble. What can you notice? What can you notice from the daily schedule of a medieval lord? It is believed that you can be able to note from the daily schedule of a medieval lord that he would need to hear Mass and say prayers every day. As he need to hear Mass and say prayers every day, we can conclude that religion was very important during the Middle Ages. However, would the political leaders nowadays be such religious? Could you imagine that they would attend Mass or say prayers every day? I guess that many of us would believe that political leaders, or even the people nowadays, may not be as religious as the people in the Middle Ages. In that sense, we mean that the society in modern times became more secular, 世俗化. So when the people became more secular in the modern times, what would they be interested in? What would be the interests of these secular people? Now let's take a look at this picture. This was a painting painted by a Dutch artist. The title of the painting is The Money Changer and His Wife. It shows a pair of couple counting their coins here. Now, so we know that they are counting the coins. So, what would they be interested in? Now, when you count the coins, you are actually trying to find out how much money you have. It is highly likely that they are trying to find out how much money they have made. And everybody would agree that when you can make money, particularly a large sum of money, you will be successful, you will be regarded as a successful person. Now, this was a painting emerging in the 16th century. And this painting shows a pair of couple counting the money which they have made, which they have earned. So this picture or the painter or the subject of this picture was related to money making. And when you can make money, you are regarded as a successful person. Therefore, we may conclude that during the 16th century, or at least during the time of the Renaissance, or maybe during the modern times, the people would appreciate personal successes. When a person could achieve something in certain areas, say for example money making, their efforts or their success would be appreciated. When we try to value personal successes, personal achievements, we would say that this person must be influenced by the idea of humanism or individualism. Now, why do you want to make money? Because you want to become rich. This is really obvious. And when you become rich, that means you own a large amount of property. So, in modern times, different societies would respect the people's right to make money and to increase their property. So we may say that during the modern times, there was greater respect for personal rights. And such personal rights might include a lot of things, a lot of rights or maybe freedom. And one type of rights that a modern society would protect would be the right to own property. Now, so let's conclude what we have discussed in this session. We have talked about the differences between the Middle Ages and modern times. We can tell that the modern societies were more secular than the medieval societies. In a modern society, individual achievements are appreciated. Say, for example, money making. When you can make money, you or your success or your effort would be appreciated in the modern societies. That led to the development of capitalism in modern times. Since that the modern societies would respect the people's right to own property, so it would extend to the respect of other personal rights, including political rights, and that led to the development of democracy in some modern societies. At the same time, we can also find that science becomes more important in the modern times. So here are the differences between the Middle Ages and the modern times. Now, having understood the characteristics of the modern times, we can take a closer look at the first point brought up by the author of our textbook, which is the beginning of modern times. Now, in that point, the author of our textbook stressed that feudalism and the Christian church no longer had great influence on the people. So, the author meant that when feudalism was adopted in the Middle Ages, the people could not develop their own idea. Why was that the case? Or what was feudalism in the first place? Now, as we have not covered feudalism, the Middle Ages and feudalism in Form 1, it may be good for us to take a closer look at how feudalism worked during the Middle Ages. Actually, feudalism was a system adopted in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages or medieval times is believed to have started with the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD. It lasts about 1,000 years until about 1450. The beginning of the Middle Ages is also called the Dark Ages because the great civilizations of Rome and Greece have been conquered. The fall of the Constantinople, which was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, in 1453 was regarded by some historians as the end of the Middle Ages. Now, feudalism was a system practiced in the Middle Ages, and under the feudal system, everyone got a ruling lord above him, except the king, as you may be able to see from this pyramid. The king was the top of the social pyramid. Okay? The king was the leader of the country. He was the leader of the kingdom. So he was placed at the top of the social pyramid of a feudal society. However, the king would not directly rule over his whole kingdom. He only ruled a part of his kingdom. He ruled his kingdom, and the farmland in his kingdom would be farmed by the peasants or the farmers here, who were at the bottom of the social pyramid during the feudal times or the Middle Ages. Now, the king would award land to the nobles. The land which the king awarded to the nobles were known as fiefs, 財入. Sometimes the king would also give some land to the church. The king gave land to the nobles and the church because the king wanted to use their soldiers, or they may want to use the influence of the nobles or the church on the citizens so that his kingdom could be protected by these people. Now, as you can see from this social pyramid, the king was placed at the top of the social pyramid under a feudal society. Under the king, we can find some lords or nobles. The king would give fief, and the peasants living on the fief, to the lords or the nobles. So the nobles would become the vassals of the king. The king gives them land and peasants. At the same time, the nobles or the lords would need to be loyal to the king, and they must also provide military services for the king. And under the nobles, we can find the knights. Like the case of a king, the farmland of the nobles, or maybe the knight, would be done by the peasants living on these farmland. So the peasants were allowed to use the land of the king, the land of the nobles, or maybe the knights to farm so that they may have some food to eat, some food to survive. So they are expected to pay rent to their lords. Now, during the Middle Ages, the peasants would form these small communities around a central lord or master. They may be nobles or knights or whatever. And these small communities were formed because of their concern for safety and defense. And these small communities were known as manor. It consists of a number of things like the castle, church, villages, and surrounding farmland. These manors were generally isolated and self-sufficient societies. Manors seldom got visitors. Now, as the feudal lords would depend on their vassals for military service, or maybe farming services, or rent, so they would try to exercise strong control over the people, or else they would not be able to get any rent or military services. So when the farmer was allowed by the nobles to farm on their farmland, the nobles would expect in return he would be able to get some rent from these farmers or peasants. So it was to the interests of the nobles that the farmers or the peasants should remain in the village. They should not go away as they wished. As a result, people could not develop their own ideas, or they would not be able to think of any future goals, or they would not have any dream for future achievement. Otherwise, feudalism would fall, because when you want to seek for personal achievement, you may not want to stay in the same village for your whole life. you may want to go to other places. In that case, the nobles might not be able to find peasants to work on their land. As a result, they would not have any income or rent. So that's why, for the interests of feudalism, kings, nobles, or even knights would prevent people from leaving the villages. And when the people developed ideas of leaving the villages, then feudalism would fall. So as a result, the common people would be discouraged from having their own idea. However, we can find from a textbook that the people could think freely during the Renaissance, so it could indicate that feudalism had already declined in Europe during the time of the Renaissance. Now that's all for our discussion for the first point. Let's take a look at the second point, the basis of modern civilization. The author of our textbook stressed that during the Renaissance, a new way of thinking developed. Feudalism and the Christian Church no longer had great influence. People could now think freely, and they began to question unreasonable ideas and beliefs. This new spirit of the Renaissance led Europe into the modern times. So, we just need to know what is meant by the new way of thinking. I think that it is quite obvious. It would be the idea of humanism, which stressed that human beings are good, human beings are important, and it was right for them to have personal achievements. Other than the development of humanism, we can also find that during the modern times, science became more important. We have already known that in a more secular society, the people might not follow the church teaching. The teaching of the church was questioned. And at the same time, during the time of the Renaissance, the people found that, particularly the scientists, found that some of the church's teaching did not agree with the scientific findings. So they brought up an idea that we should not believe in everything the church says. We can only believe in some arguments or some theories when these theories were proven right. So this brought about the development of science. With the development of science, people began to question unreasonable ideas. And this formed the basis of modern civilization. Now, one question remains for this second point. It was stressed that under the influence of humanism, achievements were made in many areas. But the problem is, how come humanism would brought about different achievements? What was the relationship between them? As you know, humanism was an important belief emerged during the time of the Renaissance. It held that human beings are important, they are perfect, and they are capable of doing everything. Now, when human beings are perfect in terms of ability or in terms of morality, when they are perfect, it is perfectly okay for them to develop ideas of their own. They should not be prevented from developing their own ideas. Why should we stop human beings who are perfect to have their own ideas? Why should we stop the human beings from practicing their own ideas when they are so perfect. Now, so this is our discussion for the 2 points. It is hoped that through this closer look at the 2 points brought up by the author of our textbook, you would be able to understand better the 2 impacts of the Renaissance on the development of modern societies. However, there are some further discussions. Let's take a look at the second point brought up by the author again. Now, the author stressed that soon after the birth of Renaissance in Italy, it spread to other parts of Europe, and under the influence of humanism, which was an important idea during the time of the Renaissance, achievements were made in many areas such as literature, painting, sculpture, and science. The development of science and arts during the Renaissance formed the basis of modern Western civilization. Now, there's a problem. We learned from our textbook that, or from the classroom discussion, that Renaissance could start in Italy or maybe other places in Europe because some rich merchants who succeeded in making large sum of money would like to offer some of their money to sponsor the artists so that the artists could come up with different kinds of masterpieces. These rich merchants could sponsor the artists because they were rich. And these merchants could become rich because they had successful businesses. When they had successful businesses, they could be said as achieving something. So we get something like this. The merchants made some achievements in the late Middle Ages, and this led to the Renaissance. And the Renaissance time artists and the Renaissance artists also came up with different kinds of achievements. These achievements brought about the emergence of modern civilization, or the achievements of these artists or scientists or whatever built the foundation of modern civilization. But the point is, feudalism was a system adopted in the Middle Ages. This system discouraged people from developing their own ideas, from developing their own dream of achieving something. So, how could achievements like making money be attained? Do you find this confusing? So with such a conflict, or with such confusion, we should ask ourselves, is our understanding about the Middle Ages a biased understanding? Or have we exaggerated the achievements of the Renaissance artists, merchants, or even scientists? Now, I have no answer to these 2 questions. You have to think about these 2 questions yourself and formulate your own ideas. However, to conclude, I would like to emphasize that when you are asked to write about the influence of the Renaissance in the examination, you can certainly write about these 2 impacts: beginning of modern times and basis of modern civilization. You can definitely refer to your textbooks for details. You can get marks by bringing the points covered in your textbook. To help you better remember the points covered in the textbook, the arguments in the textbook are summarized in this diagram. So you can be able to see that the decline of feudalism and Christian church led the people to think freely, and they developed ideas like humanism. The development of new ideas would lead the people to question unreasonable ideas of beliefs, and achievements were also made in many areas like arts, science, sculpture, so on and so forth. All these achievements and all the efforts made by the people to question unreasonable ideas and beliefs led Europe into the modern times and brought about the development of modern Western civilization. This is the end of part 1.